1,000 years before Columbus, longships touched the wild coast of North America and raised Viking halls on new soil. But almost every trace of their daring colony soon vanished. Scholars still argue why the Norse would burn their own buildings, sink their ships, and leave nothing but a single ruined camp in the frozen north. Was it war? Plague? Or a secret worth hiding from history itself? Follow the last whispers of iron, smoke, and shattered runes as we uncover how the first Europeans to reach America tried to make sure the world never knew they were here. The wind howled across the rocky coastline of Newfoundland. Its icy breath tore through the pine forest like an ancient warning. It was the year 1021 AD. Waves slammed against the shore, in rhythm with the pounding hearts of the Norsemen unloading crates from their dragon-headed ship. Their boots sank into the cold, wet soil of a continent no one in Europe was supposed to know existed. Behind them, smoke curled from the thatched roof of a wooden hall they had raised in haste. Its beams were not yet dry, but its defenses were already sharpened. Inside, Leif Erikson stood over a carved wooden table, studying a map etched with rivers and coastlines that didn't exist in any Norse scroll. He didn't speak. The silence of the men around him said everything. A sentry had vanished the night before. No signs of struggle, no tracks. Just an axe left leaning against a tree, and blood on the snow. The local tribes had watched from a distance for days, never approaching, but never disappearing either. The explorers felt eyes on them everywhere, even in their sleep. Far from Greenland, far from Vinland's friendly name. This land had teeth, and something, or someone, didn't want them there. But abandoning the site meant more than just failure. It meant erasing what they had found, and returning to the old world with no proof, no glory, only questions. As the wind slammed the door of the longhouse open and scattered their maps across the floor, Leif knew what was coming. This journey would not be remembered in song, unless someone survived to tell it. In the early 11th century, the Norse world was a fractured network of seafaring communities bound by kinship, trade, and the iron grip of survival. From the icy fjords of Norway to the green pastures of Iceland and the rugged shores of Greenland, Norse exploration had already pushed the boundaries of the known world. But for a small group of bold navigators, the edge of the map wasn't a limit, it was a challenge. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, was part of a lineage that had turned exile into empire. His father had carved a colony out of Greenland's ice. Leif wanted something more, something untouched, fertile, worthy of legend. The land they called Vinland lay across the North Atlantic, beyond the reach of kings and councils. According to the sagas, it was a place of rich soil, wild grapes, rivers teeming with fish, and forests deeper than any in Iceland. But it wasn't just its beauty that drew the Norse, it was its location. The site, believed today to be near L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, sat at the intersection of maritime routes that could eventually link Greenland, the Arctic Islands, and even parts of eastern North America. If settled successfully, Vinland could become a strategic outpost for trade, whaling, timber harvesting, and further exploration. Back in Europe, kingdoms were tangled in religious reform, shifting borders, and Viking raids that blurred the line between invader and explorer. The Norse had no unified government. Authority rested with chieftains and jarls, whose loyalties were tied to honor, kin, and conquest. What Leif and his crew did was not part of an imperial expansion. It was personal, driven by ambition, curiosity, and survival. Yet if successful, it could have changed the trajectory of history. A permanent Norse foothold in North America might have altered trade routes, introduced European metallurgy to native societies centuries earlier, or even shifted the balance of power across the Atlantic. But that's not what happened. The Norse presence in Vinland was brief, fragile, poorly documented. There were no reinforcements, no second wave of settlers, and most critically, no official support from Greenland or Iceland. Leif's discovery came at a time when his homeland was struggling with internal conflicts, harsh winters, and dwindling supplies. Colonies in Greenland were barely holding on, and the risks of maintaining a distant outpost, especially one across a brutal ocean, soon outweighed the rewards. Still, what makes this story more than a failed expedition is the deliberate silence that followed. For a culture that celebrated exploration in sagas and stone, the story of Vinland nearly disappeared. It survived only in fragmented oral accounts and scattered lines buried in Norse texts. That kind of absence doesn't happen by accident. Whether it was erased out of shame, politics, or fear, one thing is certain. The Norse reached America, but someone made sure the world would forget. The first signs of conflict didn't come as a raid or a battle. They came quietly, disappearances, whispers in the forest, the sound of canoes in the dark. The Norse had chosen their settlement site for its natural defenses, cliffs to the north, dense forest to the south, and a narrow beachhead where their ships could be pulled ashore. But the wilderness wasn't empty. The land was home to indigenous tribes, likely the ancestors of the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq, who had watched the foreign ships arrive, with fire and steel. No formal welcome was offered, no warning either, just silence, and then subtle signs that the Norse were not alone. One morning, a small group of explorers ventured upriver to map new terrain and collect timber. They never returned. Days later, one of their shields was found, wedged into a tree trunk, split down the center. Another bore marks, not from blade or claw, but fire. The message was clear. Leif ordered tighter patrols, doubled the watch, and forbade anyone from leaving camp without armed escort. But the tension was already in the air. The men grew restless, sleeping with axes beside their mats. Fires were burned smaller. Food was rationed more tightly. Whatever was out there, it was watching and waiting. Not long after, the first real clash occurred, just before dawn, while mist still rolled in from the bay. The Norse sentries spotted movement in the trees. Before they could raise the alarm, arrows hissed from the darkness. 2 guards down before they could even shout. The camp exploded into motion. Warriors grabbed their spears and axes, sprinting toward the perimeter. A volley followed, flint-tipped, hand-carved, deadly. The Norse counterattacked, charging into the tree line with brute force. But the enemy was already gone. No bodies, no trail, just blood in the moss, and tracks that ended at the river. Leif knew this wasn't random. The attack was too precise, too disciplined. These weren't savages acting on fear. They were trained defenders, striking with purpose. The Norse had built a wall around their camp, sharpened logs, but now it felt more like a cage. They couldn't stay inside forever, and they couldn't expand the settlement if every movement sparked an ambush. It was during one of these tense weeks that the name Hrold the Black began to circulate, in whispers. A quiet man, with a broad frame and a dark beard. Hrold had once served as a bodyguard to a jarl in Iceland. He spoke little, but watched everything. After a third ambush claimed 2 more men near a fishing inlet, Hrold volunteered to scout alone. Many thought it was suicide. He disappeared into the forest without a word, armed with only a short axe and a bow. 2 days later, he returned, dragging behind him the body of a fallen attacker. The man wore woven leather armor, carried a curved blade, unlike anything the Norse had seen, and around his neck hung a carved pendant inlaid with red ochre. Hrold didn't speak as he laid the body at Leif's feet, but the message was understood. The enemy bled too. The body was buried, respectfully, following Norse custom. But that didn't stop. What came next? A few nights later, war cries echoed through the woods. Fires lit up the horizon. Arrows rained from the treetops, striking the walls, the roofs, even the livestock pens. The Norse responded, with shields and torches, driving into the darkness, weapons raised. But again, they were chasing shadows. It was clear this wasn't a war for territory. It was a message. The land itself was rejecting them. Supply lines became critical. The settlers had brought dried meat, grain, and mead, enough to last a season. But without hunting, without fishing, they would starve. And yet, every time they ventured beyond the walls, they lost men. Leif sent smaller, faster parties, guards on each flank. He even set up false camps to bait the enemy. Once, it worked. A group of Norsemen hid beneath the foliage. They ambushed a scouting party at dawn. The fight was brutal and short. 2 attackers captured, 3 killed. But the prisoners refused to speak. When offered food, they spat. When offered water, they sang a slow, low chant no one recognized. That night, they were found dead in their cell, throats cut with sharpened stones. No one saw them carry. The settlers began to question the gods. Some said the land was cursed. Others claimed Odin had turned his face from them. At night, prayers grew louder. By day, tempers flared. 2 men brawled over a stolen fish. 1 died. Leif ordered the dead buried, outside the camp, far from the living. But even the graves were no longer safe. One was found disturbed. The body, missing, and claw marks carved into the wooden cross. Hrold took it, personally. He began sleeping outside the wall near the trees, watching, waiting, saying nothing. But the attacks began to slow, whether out of fear, fatigue, or something else. The forest grew quieter. That's when they made a decision. If they could not claim the land, they would not leave it behind. They would burn their marks, scatter the clues, erase the paths that led to their doors. The early tensions had grown into a quiet war. One fought not for victory, but for memory. And for the Norse in Vinland, memory was now the most dangerous enemy of all. The storm that rolled in on the first day of winter felt like a siege of the gods. Sheets of sleet lashed the palisade, drowning the watchfires, granting the defenders no light and the attackers perfect cover. Near midnight, the longhouse doors rattled beneath an avalanche of arrows, tipped with bone and lit pitch. Flames took to the wet roofs anyway, hissing and popping, as if the sky itself was spitting hate. Leif Erikson shouted orders, but his voice was lost in the roar of wind. What the enemy couldn't see, they could smell. Burning pine, wet fur, Viking fear. Hrold the Black led the first counterstroke. He gathered 6 Huskarls, each sworn to guard him since Greenland. They charged the southern gate in a tight, silent wedge. They burst through the half-barred door and met a wall of spears glinting beneath flashes of lightning. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. Then, Hrold tipped his round shield forward, hooked an enemy spear, and yanked the warrior into his axe. The crunch of bone was louder than thunder. Blood sprayed across the gateposts, steaming in the cold. The Huskarls roared and pushed ahead, axes wheeling like saw blades. Later, Leif would name this the first break, because after it, the attackers learned Viking shields were not walls, they were doors to knives. By dawn, 4 defenders had fallen, and at least 9 attackers lay dead beneath the palisade. The settlers found no trophies on the bodies, only tattoos of red ochre spirals on their chests, and symbols carved into their teeth. Leif ordered the fallen burned on separate pyres, Norse on one, natives on another. "We honor courage," he said, "even when it tries to kill us." The men accepted his words, but many watched the second fire too long, as if hoping the smoke might carry a warning back into the forest. A week later came the blood fog. Dense mist rolled off the bay and swallowed sound. Guards on the watchtower rang horns, but the calls died in the damp air. Shadows drifted between buildings, without footsteps. Runes scratched on the side of the forge glowed wet in torchlight, but no one had carved them. Panic spread like sickness. During the noon meal, a spear burst through the wall of the cookhouse, pinning a potman named Torfi to the beam. His last breath left his mouth in a plume of white. When warriors rushed outside, they found only the spear shaft, vibrating in the wind, and footprints that ended at bare earth. That night, Torfi's brother, Sven, swore to Odin that the price of that spear would be repaid in blood and iron. He slipped from camp, alone, wearing no armor, only a wolfskin cloak and a belt of throwing knives. At dawn, he returned, dragging a wounded attacker bound in rawhide. Sven's chest was scored with 3 arrows, none deep enough to kill, and he walked. As if pain was a story for other men, the captive refused all food and water, staring at the sky until his breath gave out. Before dying, he mouthed a single word. No one understood. Leif gave Sven an arm ring of beaten silver, the first decoration ever granted on Vinland soil. Sven slid it on, next to Torfi's braid, cut from the corpse, before burial. Winter deepened, supplies thinned. A council of elders argued to abandon the settlement, sail back to Greenland, warn the world of a hostile land across the sea. Hrolld smashed his fist on the board. "If we leave now, the dead leave angry," he said. Leif said nothing at first. He stared into the central fire, as embers danced like omen runes. Then he stood and pointed north, toward the iron forge. "Until that fire dies, we hold Vinland," he declared. The elders fell silent. No iron meant no nails, no tools, no weapons. Without the forge, the ships could not be repaired for the voyage home. The forge became the heart of the defense and the beacon for attack. The second great battle began with silence again, broken by a single ringing strike against the anvil. Gylfi the smith was shaping rivets when a stone the size of a fist sailed through the smoke hole and shattered the coals. Sparks sprayed across his face. He reeled back, blind, and roared a curse. Warriors rushed in, but the attackers had already scaled the rear wall, sliding over timber like shadows. A young shield maiden named Astrid, daughter of Thorvald the Navigator, intercepted the first intruder as he landed. She blocked his obsidian blade with her forearm guard, spun, and drove her spear clean through his thigh. He howled, and that howl became the signal. Dozens poured into the yard, 10 defenders against at least 30 assailants. Leif himself joined the melee, wielding a longsword gifted by the King of Norway. Sparks leapt from its edge as he parried stone blades and shattered bone handles. Astrid fought back to back with him, her breath icy in the night air, her braids soaked in sweat and blood. Gylfi regained his sight and hurled red-hot tongs like brands. They seared flesh where they struck. For 30 breaths, chaos reigned. Then Hrolld arrived, already bloodied, carrying a burning log ripped from the watchfire. He swung it in a wide arc, scattering attackers. 2 caught fire, screaming as skin blistered. The yard filled with smoke, of burning hair, wet blood, and rage. The enemy fell back, dragging their wounded, leaving scorch marks across the snow. A single horn sounded from the woods, long, low, mournful, and the forest swallowed them once more. Astrid slumped against the forge, her arm hanging useless. The spear cracked at the head. Leif pressed cloth to the wound. "Shield Maiden of Vinland," he whispered. It was the first time he granted her an honor name. He broke a gold link from his cloak clasp, placed it in her palm. She tried to refuse, but he closed her fingers around it. "Take it," he said. "You kept the fire alive." But the victory tasted like ash. 4 more Norse were dead, including Gylfi's apprentice, his throat slit, before anyone reached him. They burned more wood for funeral pyres than for warming huts. Food stores dwindled to weeks. Hrold proposed a night assault, take the fight to the enemy camp, end the war in a single stroke. Leif hesitated. The men were exhausted, the women tending wounds, but surrendering the initiative meant slow starvation. The next dawn, 23 warriors prepared for what they called the Wolf Walk. They wrapped shields in fur to muffle sound, blackened their faces with forge soot. At their head marched Hrold, hood low, axe glinting like winter sun. They moved through snow that creaked like old wood. At the river bend, they found an abandoned fish trap, still dripping with silver salmon. A lure or a sign of hurried flight? They advanced half a mile more. Then the first volley struck. Arrows rained from both banks, angles impossible in the dark. Hrold roared and charged the left flank. Sven followed, knives flashing like shards of moonlight. Blades met antler clubs and carved wood shields in a blur of sparks. Every Norseman fought 2 foes, sometimes 3, but for each that fell, a Viking answered with steel to bone. Sven slit a bowman's throat, caught the falling weapon, and returned the arrow into the forest, like a promise. Half the warriors lay wounded when the enemy horn sounded retreat, but Hrold would not let them vanish. He and Sven pursued through roots and brush until they burst into a clearing, lit by dim coals. The enemy village, hastily abandoned, huts of bark and mud, drying racks of fish, and in the center, a pole painted in red ochre, topped with a carved bear skull. Hrold swung his axe, once, twice, shattered the pole at its base. Then he planted his own shield in the dirt, a red disc marked with a black wolf. He declared, "The ground answers for Torfi, for the apprentice, for every Viking lost." But as they searched the camp, they found something stranger. Norse goods, untouched. Beads from Greenland. A spindle from Iceland. Iron nails, stolen from the shipyard. All laid out on mats, like offerings or trophies. In a bark basket lay Astrid's broken spearhead, cleaned of blood. It looked less like loot and more like a warning. Sven wanted to burn the village, but Hrold stopped him. "Fire only hides truth in smoke," he said. They took what could help: fish, furs, and a single pendant, matching the first captives. Then they returned, under a sky streaked red with sunrise. Back at Vinland camp, the wounded cheered their return, but Leif's face showed no joy. He studied the pendant, a spiral carved into bone. "Do you believe the war is over?" he asked. Hrold shook his head. "We cut the branch," he said, "but the root waits." Leif ordered the ship stocked for emergency departure, but he kept the forge burning. Even in defeat, he would not abandon the iron heart of Vinland. Winter finally broke under a pale spring sun, but the settlement had already chosen its fate. They dismantled the longhouse, packed iron tools, and buried the forge slag under 10 feet of earth. Every runestone smashed, every path covered in pine needles, every nail pulled from beam holes. When the last ship pushed off the beach, Hrold looked back only once. The shore was empty. Yet in the forest, the red ochre spirals glowed faintly on tree trunks, watching them leave. He tightened his grip on the wolf-marked shield and whispered a vow no saga would ever record. "Silence will guard Vinland, better than swords ever could." The survivors returned to Greenland, thinner, quieter, darker in the eyes. Leif spoke of rich grapes and good timber, but never again of the war in the west. Astrid healed. Her gold link melted into a ring, worn beneath her glove. Hrold hung his axe above the door, but never touched it. Sven carved a wolf on his brother's grave, and said nothing more. The Icelandic skalds who came for stories found only fragments, The saga that emerged was half dream, half warning. Enough to hint at glory, but never enough to map the way. And so, the first Europeans to stand on American soil washed their footprints from the sand, leaving behind a legend too thin to hold, yet too heavy to lift. In the restless silence between two worlds, that legend still breathes, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to fill its lungs again. But before that silence came fire. The night sky over Vinland cracked open with thunder, but it wasn't a storm, it was fire. A dozen blazes erupted along the tree line, without warning, controlled, spaced, deliberate. The Norse, still rebuilding what little they could, rushed from half-finished shelters to see the forest lighting up like a siege beacon. Flames licked the sky. Smoke curled low over the camp. Dogs howled. Horses reared. Children screamed for fathers, now arming in the dark. This was no raid. This was a message, and it was being written in ash. Leif Erikson stood at the center of the chaos, pulling on his chainmail in grim silence, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes clear. "This is it," he said quietly. Around him, warriors scrambled, barrels dragged, waterskins laid out. The heat pressed in, like a living force, and still. The woods whispered with movement they could not see. Then came the first sound. Low, deep, drums, echoing from the trees. Not metal, but wood and skin, rhythmic, ancient, and growing louder. The enemy had never done this before, never announced themselves. Now, they were calling them out, daring them to answer. A whistle pierced the air, an arrow, thunk, into the wall, another, into a barrel. Then, a scream. A man on the east tower spun and fell backward, arrow to the throat. That was the signal. A wave of attackers surged from the tree line, a black tide, shrieking war cries, flinging fire-tipped spears. Their silhouettes danced in the flames, faces painted, limbs bare, blades catching firelight, like lightning. The Norse held the wall. Axes met spears, shields rang out, like drums of their own. Every man had blood on his hands within seconds. Astrid, her wounded arm now splintered in leather, fought like a fury from the ramparts, knocking down ladders, firing arrows, one after another, with her good arm. Below, Sven led the charge through the southern breach, knives spinning, striking with deadly precision. "Push them back to the trees!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. And for a moment, it looked like they could. But then, from the far edge of camp, near the forge, came the groan of splintering wood. The western barricade was breached. Leif turned instantly. "They're going for the forge," he said, his voice hollow. "They're not here for victory. They're here for erasure." He sprinted across the muddy compound, smoke trailing behind him like a cloak. Hrold was already there, bloodied but unbent, standing atop the forge roof. In one hand, a flaming brand. In the other, a war axe. Around him, half a dozen Norse formed a tight ring, blades glinting red, backs to the heat. But the enemy wasn't rushing in. They were circling, surrounding, waiting. And that's when the horn blew again, this time from within the camp. They had been flanked. A second group of attackers, smaller, silent, had slipped through the smoke and fire. Now they burst into the heart of Vinland, setting tents ablaze, overturning supply carts, smashing water barrels. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a dismantling. One calculated, brutal strike after another, not meant to win, but to erase every trace of Norse presence on this land. Hrold bellowed from the rooftop, "This ends here!" and leapt into the firelight. He landed on one knee, swung upward in a clean arc, splitting the nearest attacker open. His axe met skulls, shoulders, arms, never missing, never slowing. Leif reached the forge just in time to see Hrold take a blow to the ribs. He staggered, but did not fall. He stepped into the next strike. buried his blade in a chest, and pulled it free with a wet snap. "They don't get the forge," he growled through bloodied teeth. "Not while I breathe." Sven joined the circle, dragging a flaming log behind him. He hurled it, setting 2 attackers ablaze. Their screams rose. Above the roar of the fire, Astrid refused to stay back. She climbed the tower, launched a lit arrow into the forest, a signal for any scout still alive. But no reply came. Within minutes, the camp had become a furnace. Half the structures burning, livestock gone, the main ship smouldering beneath a sheet of burning pitch. The message was clear. The Norse would leave nothing behind, and neither would their enemy. In the final moments, Hroald was seen, dragging a crate of iron nails from the forge and throwing it into the river. Leif helped toss another. Tools, weapons, everything of value. "If we can't stay," Hroald said, panting, "we take the story with us." His side was coated in blood. He wouldn't make it to morning. The sun began to rise, slow and sullen, over the wreckage of Vinland. The enemy had pulled back into the trees. Not routed, finished. Their work was done. Fires still burned. Smoke still choked the air. And the forge, once a symbol of Norse endurance, now stood blackened and cracked, its chimney collapsed. Of the 60 who came, barely 20 stood, bloodied, limping, hollow-eyed. No cheer, no songs, only ash, splinters, and the crushing truth that their place in history had just been erased with fire and steel. But in the smoldering dirt near the forge, something gleamed, half-buried, blackened, but still whole. A single coin, stamped with the wolf sigil, still warm, and someone, someday, would find it. Morning light crawled over the wrecked camp, like a slow confession. Leif counted 41 bodies in the ash, 21 Norse, the rest attackers. 12 still breathed, but couldn't walk. 4 bled from wounds too deep to close. The tally felt unreal, as if the earth had swallowed half the camp in a single night. They built a field station beside the river, using planks pried from burnt huts. Astrid boiled spruce resin for bandages. Sven stitched gashes by lamplight, his hands shaking, but sure. Hroald lay on a bearskin, ribs cracked, eyes locked on the curling smoke from the forge. When Leif knelt beside him, the big man whispered, "Iron outlasted me after all," then closed his eyes and drifted beyond reach. With the forge broken, every nail became priceless. Carpenters sealed the gate with salvaged iron rivets. Others dug a trench to flood the main lane, a crude moat of half-frozen water. It gave them a fragile wall of time. But Leif refused to wait for the next attack. He ordered Sven to lead 9 fit men on a counterstrike at dusk. Follow the scorched trail, find their cache, burn it. They set out with wolfskin cloaks, 2 spears each, and pouches of pitch-soaked moss. Astrid watched them vanish into the tree line. She prayed that fewer enemies would return behind them. The raiding party moved fast, keeping the river at their flank, 3 miles out. They caught the scent of smoked fish, turned inland, crawled under spruce boughs, and found it, a crude stockade lit by birch bark lanterns, 20 warriors, twice as many captives. Sven chose silence over glory. They crept to the woodpile, stuffed pitch into its core, and lit it with flint. Flames leapt higher than the treetops. Before the first alarm cry, when the gate exploded open, the Norse had already melted into the forest. Burning embers floated behind them, like angry stars. They reached camp at dawn, 1 man missing, 2 limping, but they carried proof of success. 3 rescued settlers, charred fragments of stolen iron. More important was what they learned. The attackers were moving south, deeper into lands no saga dared name. Leif studied the report with hollow relief. The threat was fading, but so was any chance of holding Vinland. He gathered the council by the broken forge. Snow fell in slow spirals as he spoke. No ship will survive another month. No warrior can fight without rest. The vote was quick. They would leave before the next full moon. But they'd leave nothing worth finding. For 6 days, they dismantled every wall, pulled every nail, buried hinges beneath river clay. They sank the smaller boat in a bog, filled its hull with broken tools, let the muck seal their secrets. Meanwhile, Astrid turned one longboat into a floating ward, its belly lined with pine boughs and seal pelts. When the tide came, 4 men pushed the craft toward the sea, a silent medevac bound for Greenland. Weeks ahead of the main party, 1 man died the first night from fever. They wrapped him in sailcloth and slipped him into the dark water. No prayers, no words. Back in camp, fire consumed the last longhouse. Smoke twisted high, blurring the stars above the bay. Leif stood beside the pyre, holding Hrold's axe. Its edge dulled and cracked. He thrust it into the flames, choosing ash over relic. Around him, the last settlers packed dried fish, pine pitch, and the single surviving sail. 34 souls now, each carrying more scars than belongings. The retreat began under a pale dawn, the beach thick with frost. As oars bit the surf, Sven pressed a bone pendant into Astrid's hand, the spiral symbol they'd found at the enemy camp. "Proof we were here," he said, "in case the sagas forget." Astrid tucked it beneath her cloak, gazed at the shrinking shoreline. A thin plume still rose where the forge had stood, the last breath of a settlement that would soon become legend. 3 weeks later, the North Atlantic punished them. Sleet, headwinds, cracked hulls. 1 sailor lost 2 fingers to frostbite. Astrid fashioned splints from whale rib. "You'll live," she said, "to point home again." Every mile felt heavier than the last, but no one turned back. When Greenland's cliffs finally broke the horizon, the cheers died quickly into quiet sobs. The cost was clear. 14 dead in battle, 7 from wounds or cold, and countless dreams buried in one scorched clearing across the sea. Leif ordered a cairn built on the beach, stacked stone in silence. At its base, he laid Hrold's arm ring, Astrid's broken spearhead, the pendant with the unknown spiral. No runes, no names, only the weight of what they chose not to say. In seasons that followed, rumors flickered through Norse settlements of a fertile land far west, but no maps came, only whispers. Leif spoke of sacred silence. Sven kept his blades sharp, but never again sought the sea. Astrid forged a new ring from scraps of Vinland iron. She wore it beneath her glove, and sometimes, when the northern lights rippled across the sky, she traced the spiral pendant and wondered if the strangers in the forest still guarded the ashes of her lost home. The story of Vinland faded, piece by piece, until scholars began to doubt it ever existed. But the waves still murmur against Newfoundland's coast, and beneath moss and marsh lie nails, beads, and 1 cracked axe head, mute witnesses waiting for the next shovel to peel back the earth. If that day comes, the world will learn. Vinland didn't fail from weakness. It withdrew by choice, dragged its history into the fog, leaving only whispers for the wind to carry. Centuries passed, and still, the sagas only whispered of Vinland, always vague, always half-believed. 1 sailor-turned-cleric wrote, "We touched a place where the sun felt closer, and the silence beneath the trees was not empty, but watching. His name is lost, but his words remain, etched in vellum, like a wound never quite healed." The legacy of Vinland was not its failure, but its refusal to be recorded. A colony that could have changed history, instead chose disappearance. It was the only war the Norse ever fought where silence was their final tactic. And in that silence, it became something greater than empire. It became myth. Modern archaeologists have found little. A few iron nails, a Norse spindle, a broken cloak pin. Each one, a whisper. Not enough to build a city from, but enough to know That one once stood. Dr. Ingrid Nystrom once said, "The Vikings didn't fail in America. They succeeded in leaving no fingerprints." And perhaps that was the point. Some victories aren't carved in stone. They're kept in silence, preserved in the choice to vanish with dignity. Today, all that remains are stories. And yet, story is everything. The spiral symbol now appears in Greenland folk art. No one remembers where it came from, but it's said to ward off fire. Perhaps, buried in that symbol, is a memory, not of defeat, but of survival. There's power in what we forget, and even more, in what refuses to stay buried. Spring 2021. A fisherman off the Labrador coast pulled driftwood from his net, embedded in its grain. A rusted nail, hand-forged, unmistakably old. Officials shrugged, but the fisherman kept it, mounted it, hung it in his boathouse, just in case. Because somewhere, beyond the breakers, beneath centuries of sand and sea, lies the truth that the first footprints of Europe in the New World were not made with conquest, but with fire, retreat, and a vow to be forgotten. And now, long after the fires cooled and the last oar left the surf, only one question remains. If the Norse were here and chose to leave, what did they see that made them believe the world wasn't ready?